class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 19 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Detroit Red Wings, in which the Sharks have lost 7-4, a pretty crazy score that is representing an extremely crazy game. This one really did go back and forth. It looked like the Sharks would be able to win, then the Red Wings suddenly came back and looked like they had that one down, but then the Sharks came back and looked like they'd be unstoppable, but then the Red Wings came back and they ended up closing out this game. So very, very back and forth. Definitely an extremely fun game to watch, and depending on what camp you fall in, it maybe is even the optimal score for you. If you're hoping that the Sharks are losing games but losing fun games, this is really as much as you could possibly hope for. Obviously, if you're someone who was hoping for the Sharks to actually win, this loss does mark the end of a 3-game winning streak, and they were coming into this game against a Detroit Red Wings squad that had lost the last 4, so it was one that seemed very winnable for the Sharks, and based on the amount of chances and how well they played here tonight, they probably should have been able to get this win. What's actually interesting is back earlier on this season, when the Sharks were really struggling to score, looking at the roster, that was really not much of a surprise, but I had mentioned that the way that the Sharks would win most of their games in the season would basically be how their goaltending does. If their goaltending let in 3 or more goals, they'd probably lose, and if they let in less than 3 goals, they would have a chance. But this game actually ends up being the opposite. The Sharks actually get 4 goals of support, which should be enough to win most nights in the NHL, but their goaltending kind of fails them, which I will also get to a bit later. But he lets in 6 goals. The 7th one was an empty net, but 6 goals, that's not a very good recipe to be able to win in the NHL, not just these days, but really any time of any point in any season. On to how this game went. The Sharks started off very well. They were very much the dominant team in the first period. They would start the scoring off with a Kevin Labanc goal. The Red Wings would manage to tie it up, but then Matt Nieto, with a very nice move, would actually be able to get the lead for the Sharks, and they were crushing the Red Wings. Like I said, the Red Wings were on a 4-game losing streak. The Sharks looked really good and were on a 3-game winning streak, so it seemed as though they might just close it out, even if that was maybe speaking a bit too soon at 20 minutes into it, and that clearly ended up being the case. While the second period wasn't actually that terribly played for the Sharks, they actually got a decent chunk of chances. Ville Husso definitely cleaned up his game from the first period, where he was a bit suspect, and in the second period the Red Wings would be the only team to score, and they'd get 2 to turn a 2-1 deficit into a 3-2 lead for themselves. And then early in the third period, Veleno would actually add another one to make it 4-2 Red Wings. And so at that point it seemed as though maybe this game would just end there, but the Sharks had yet another, or it seemed as though they had yet another amazing third period comeback in them. It feels as though every game in these past few days have just been the Sharks trailing going into the third period and then somehow managing to actually win, or at least bring it to overtime. And this was no exception. It was actually an exception because they did lose, but it was no exception to the fact that they managed to at least get this game tied back up. The Sharks would get not 1 but 2 goals, including a Karlsson one for his 11th of the year, to make it 4-4. And so it seemed as though the Sharks had all of the momentum and they'd be able to get this win, but a pretty weak goal ended up being let in by Reimer. The Red Wings take the 5-4 lead, and then a pretty weak one as well on Suter, and the Sharks are trailing 2 goals, and that kind of took the wind out of their sails. They do immediately pull the goaltender, but not much is doing in the 6-on-5 situation, and then they eventually give up the empty netter to make it 7-4. So the Sharks, they showed a ton of resiliency, and they actually played quite well in this game. Even though they managed the 4 goals, they probably could have had like at least 5-6 plus based on the amount of chances that they did get, but in the end they end up falling to the Red Wings in regulation. And on to the players to talk about. Speaking of those amount of chances, the first line once again here for the San Jose Sharks, the best line by far for them. Meyer probably could have had a couple goals here. Labanc did score 1 and probably could have had like 2 or 3. He had some great opportunities, including a very, very close call with the post. And Labanc has definitely been fitting in very well onto this top line, definitely much better than really anybody else who they have tried in this position, like Cunnin or like Svechnikov. Labanc does have a bit of a knack for the net, I guess you could say, and a very strong shot. So while he's not necessarily setting things up well, you're never really saying, wow, what a great pass and read by Kevin Labanc or anything like that. You occasionally say that. There was that one goal a couple of games ago, but realistically, especially in this game, we saw that on full display. It's Meyer or it's Hertl or it's Erik Karlsson as well, feeding Labanc for some sort of golden opportunity where he has found himself kind of a pocket of space on the ice to be able to get a shot off. This was how he scored this goal. This was how he got like his other 3 high danger chances. And so this first line once more, as for like the 5th or 6th straight game, I've lost count, has just been absolutely leading the way for the San Jose Sharks. But that's not to say, like some of the previous games, that the other Sharks lines were completely slacking. On the second line here of Couture, Barabanov, and Nieto, I thought these 3 players played rather well. Couture was definitely the beneficiary of a couple of plays and managed to get some points for himself. Barabanov set up a couple of very, very nice ones. I believe the first one led to a Hurdle post. Barabanov came out of the box, set one up on a very nice pass for Tomas Hurdle, and then he ends up hitting the post. And then a second opportunity was in a very similar situation, not out of the box this time, but a similar situation on the ice, sets up another very nice pass, doesn't of course end up amounting to a goal, but Barabanov was getting some good looks. And of course Matt Nieto, like I mentioned earlier, very, very nice goal, even though this wasn't a great one for Husso to let in. Obviously, if the goaltender had played decently well, he would have been able to make that save, and we wouldn't really be talking about this one necessarily. It was still very nice. The fact that Nieto was literally surrounded by 4 defensemen, or 2 defensemen and 2 players, 2 forwards, so 4 Red Wings players. The fact that he's surrounded by these people and he still manages to actually not only get a shot off but score a goal was definitely very impressive. I mean, he's not Connor McDavid, he's Matt Nieto, so the fact that he does that even if it's a weak goal is definitely quite nice. On to the third line. Usually I talk down about this third line, where even in positives I say that they were just not bad, like not terrible. That was their positive remark. But here tonight, actually pretty solid for the San Jose Sharks, all things considered. I don't think this is saying much, but this may have been Nick Bonino's best game of the season thus far. Again, that doesn't mean he was a world beater here tonight, but he looked pretty decent. Actually set up a couple of decent offensive zone plays, and for once wasn't just completely living in the Sharks defensive zone all game. Luke Kunin had a couple of very good chances for himself. Nico Sturm helped tie that line together, and so generally the third line ended up being a positive for the San Jose Sharks, like an actual positive for the first time in like 10 games. On the other hand, however, the fourth line didn't really have as much of a positive effect for the San Jose Sharks. These players, when they were on the ice, they were usually finding themselves in the defensive zone. There just isn't really much chemistry between the 3 of them. Lindblom continues to be invisible. Svechnikov did have that goal a couple of games ago, but hasn't really done much since. And Lorentz, while I think Lorentz is definitely the sort of diamond in the rough here on this fourth line, because of his 2 line mates that aren't necessarily pulling their weight, Lorentz doesn't really get to do much, and so it was definitely a bit of a rough night for the fourth line. But because the top 3 lines did so well, it doesn't necessarily matter. On to the defensemen, we of course have to talk about Erik Karlsson. He gets not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 points here on the night, including, like I mentioned earlier, his 11th goal of the season. This puts him at 28 points on the year. The amount of players who are actually ahead of him in terms of total points in the entire league, counting forwards, not just defensemen, where he leads by a wide margin, but including every single possible player, there was only a single player ahead of him in terms of points, and that is, of course, Connor McDavid, who's up there at 32, but he just tied Leon Draisaitl with 28. Karlsson continues to be extremely impressive on the offensive side of things, but on the other side of the ice, one important stat that we can actually talk about here, and not to try and talk down on Karlsson for the 4-point night where he tried to literally drag the San Jose Sharks across the finish line. He was the catalyst for much of their offense. Him and of course that first line, but primarily Erik Karlsson for sure. But if we take a look at the statistics, all 4 of his points were actually earned at even strength, and yet he ends up actually as a -1 on this game. He was on the ice for a bunch of these Red Wings goals against. Literally all 4 of the goals in the third period, Karlsson was on the ice for, and you could certainly look at him as not necessarily the problem, but as the player kind of closest to the puck. I won't really blame him on the empty net one. Obviously, that's just kind of a free minus, but the Veleno one, this puck jumps over his stick, which allows Veleno to then pick up the rebound and go for that wraparound play. He's not able to win the race with Pius Suter, And while, yes, technically if Reimer stays in the net, this probably doesn't actually end up being a goal, so it's more so Reimer's fault. But still, if Karlsson is actually winning that race, it's definitely a situation where Reimer would stay in the net and not be encouraged to actually try and make that aggressive play. So Karlsson, while he was definitely helping the Sharks on one end of the ice, he was also sort of showing that other side of him on the defensive side of things. Still, definitely a very, very positive game from Erik Karlsson. I'm not trying to say that he was actually bad in some sort of like crazy backwards way. He clearly was one of the best players for the San Jose Sharks here tonight, if not the best player for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. But just to mention, I found it kind of interesting that he ended up still being a -1. The other player to mention on the defensive side of things I do want to talk about is Cicek, because, of course, after his previous game, I mentioned that he probably wouldn't get this next one because he was, sort of directly responsible for the 2 goals against given up in the previous one. So I thought that Scott Harrington would potentially draw into the lineup, but instead Scott Harrington ends up actually getting placed onto waivers. So it'll be interesting to see once Shemek returns to the lineup whether or not Cicek will actually end up being the 7th forward for the San Jose Sharks. And I don't know if David Quinn saw something I didn't, or maybe this is like some crazy imaginary play where you actually give a young player an opportunity after messing up to play a second game. I know that's completely unheard of, because usually when like a Ryan Merkley or a Thomas Bordeleau makes one small misplay, they end up like getting sent to Siberia or something like that. Cicek actually gets the second straight game and definitely looked improved. Of course, Cicek is the type of player where if you don't notice him, he is doing the right thing, right? And when you do notice him, it's not usually in a positive way, right? When we talk about an Erik Karlsson, if I were to say, hey, did you see Erik Karlsson's play last night? I'm 99% of the time talking about offense. If I was saying, oh, did you see Cicek's play last night? I'm probably talking about a defensive situation and a mistake like he did in that previous game on both of those goals against, and so definitely an improvement here tonight. And finally, to talk about Reimer, definitely an extremely rough game, likely his worst game of the season thus far, and it's a bit sad because Reimer in the previous couple of performances had been really, really good for the San Jose Sharks, so it seems as though David Quinn was rolling with him, kind of putting Kähkönen on the sidelines a bit here as the second goaltender and letting Reimer try and win that starting job, and this might sort of convince Quinn to actually give another look to Kähkönen for the next game on Saturday, because Reimer definitely looked rough. This isn't even a situation where you're saying like, oh, he let in 6 goals, but the defense didn't really do him any favors. He definitely could have made the save on like 4 of these goals. The Pius Suter one was a complete mess where he just makes the wrong call at that point. The Seider one was definitely a goal that a save that he could have made. The Valletta one was definitely a bit tough, but maybe he could have reacted to it a bit faster. Basically, I'm not going to go through every single one of these goals, but many of them, Reimer definitely had more than just a fleeting chance on. So certainly a very rough game for the Sharks goaltender. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they will take on the New York Rangers for the second and final time this season. Interestingly enough, with the Rangers, this is the team that the Sharks actually got their first win of the entire year versus. They, of course, started the season 0-5, but in that 6th game, they beat up the Rangers in that overtime game, and we'll see if that will sort of lead to the Sharks potentially getting another win and potentially moving back into the win column, or if the Rangers will be able to get their revenge. Class dismissed.